Thank you so much for everyone who has stayed until the end. It's been a really tiring and, well, exciting but also tiring day. So thank you so much for being here. I'd like to start this presentation talking about what is this talk not about. So I'm not gonna to be presenting about why open source has won, why now open source runs in software and software runs in open source. So there's a lot of interesting talks on that, a lot of research on that. I'm not gonna be talking about the typical motivators for organizations to start getting engaged with open source, mostly about security, and also ways to drive innovation. Again, I think there are clear talks related with that already. I'm here to talk about open source sustainability, and more specifically, talk about ways to make it right within organizations. Before starting, short story about myself. We already get the introductions, but I'm the OSPO program manager at Todo Group, but I was formerly at Vitergia. So that is software development analytics firm company. In there, I get this deep knowledge in OSPOs, in open source program offices, inner source, adopting an open source culture within the organizations. And my master's in data science were focused on how to measure the developer relation success of open source communities with community health metrics. I'm involved in other open source communities and projects such as Chaos, Inner Source Commons, DevRel Collective, or OpenChain. And in my other life, I'm a vivid illustrator and designer using open source tooling like Krita and Inkscape. And I also do, I have an anime band where I sing there and try to teach cool stuff on Japanese. Anyway, so getting into the sustainability topic. There are some questions I've heard around the open source community that are around sustainability. The first one is, well, how can organizations improve open source sustainability? Like we know as corporations and other organizations, there should be a commitment on that scale, but sometimes the how it's difficult to start with. And also another question that I've just put this day because I attended to the Sustain breakout room, and there was this topic about open source sustainability and how can organizations do the things right around open source sustainability, was how can organizations sustain healthy existence? Because it's not about just making open source in the long term in the organization and preserve that, but also how can we make sure the organizations are doing it in a healthy way and not harming the open source ecosystem? So the short answer will be open source program offices, and see open source program offices as the vehicle to make that possible. But let's deep dive more into that. So what exactly is an OSPO? Because many of you, I'm sure you have heard many organizations claiming, I have an OSPO, we have built an open source program offices, more like a trend thing. But it's more than that. It's more than a word. It's basically moving from this to this. Instead of doing open source ad hoc, instead of saying, okay, open source is there, we are using open source, we know we are engaging in open source, and we are trying to put layers to fix something and then forget about open source because we don't think it's important. It's about having commitment on that. It's about making sure the organizations knows open source, it's here and it's here to stay. So you're given resources and enough funding to build metrics of experts, people that will engage in open source to have a clear overview of the open source operations that happens within the organization. So it's basically that. It's a way to adopt a strategic posture around open source and act as the center of competency for an organization's open source operations and structure. But I've also heard so many people say, okay, I get that the value of OSPOs for organizations, it's clear, but is it really helping open source communities to thrive? Are they really helping on that? And I just wanted to point out to recent research from LF Europe that were analyzing the perceived change in the value of open source from an organizational perspective. So those respondents that says that they have clear and visible leader on open source strategy. So the value for those that had an OSPO or similar open source initiative there increased. And we can see that the ones that didn't, that perception of value was lower in many ways. We also saw that by having an OSPO, there were those that had an OSPO were more strongly disagree on the lack of policy, lack of understanding. So in a nutshell, they had more clear understanding on how to operate in those in the strategy and how to operate in those environments than those that didn't. Because yeah, we get that OSPOs can bring a strategic relationship with open source. So they can have many responsibilities. They can manage compliance. It's one of the major issues we find, at least in enterprises and those OSPOs that are working there. Also build a standardized process on how to contribute to open source, how to launch new open source projects. Maybe for others, it can be the means to achieve interoperability. And I said these are some of those because into the group we say that your OSPO is not my OSPO. So this is just like a set of suggestions and how some organizations perceive value. Maybe others have different ways. But they can also, and they should bring a healthy relationship with the open source ecosystems. So don't say it as they are also bringing value to organizations, but they are there to act as the translators with the open source community. So with these metrics of experts and coordinators, they communicate with both, with the open source communities and also with the internal actors in the organization. So those that can come in the shape of stakeholders, in contractors, business units, and teams. In a nutshell, they can bring different benefits, such as help to bridge the gap between the traditional software practices and the open source dynamics. They can bring continuity, so that the open source remains in the long term. They can also help to the creation and development of certain tools to enable this open source dynamics and collaboration. And they can also help with education within the organization that we will talk in a while. So here are some recommendations. And I want to highlight the word recommendations because, as I said earlier, your OSPO is not my OSPO. In fact, in the Todo community, what we have are guidelines and try to establish best practices, but there is no broad template to build an OSPO. So take this as, well, this is what in other organizations worked, but you can pick and choose whatever fits to your needs. Because there are different ways to engage in open source. I'm sure everyone knows on that. And a quick example can be the goals. The goals of the organizations can change. It's not the same if we are talking about to an enterprise, that the goals are going to be more business-oriented, or governments can be more social-oriented to serve the citizens. For instance, can be a common goal, or to achieve interoperability can be a common goal, or to universities, that maybe their goals can be more educational-oriented. So each of those organizations can have different motivators to engage in open source, and thus to be an OSPO. But the OSPO is going to be that vehicle anyway. And of course, apart from that, each organization, they have their own culture and values. They have their own different sizes, different teams, and they have a history with the open source previously. Like, there are some organizations that the open source culture, it's really in them, and they clearly understand that, but there are others coming from traditional environments that maybe they started with some ad hoc efforts, but then the project died somewhere, and now they need to retake what they did and try to put order into all that chaos. So saying that, here are some questions that an OSPO leader or the organization can ask when starting an OSPO. So first, where does the organization want to use open source, or where is the organization using open source? And what will the organization ensure to achieve these objectives? Also, when thinking about building the OSPO, how will a minimum viable OSPO look for your organization? Depending on the size, the funding you have, the goals you're having, and also what will be part of this minimum viable OSPO, what kind of a staff, the resources you will need while deep dive into the OSPO, and why this plan, when creating the OSPO, and the strategy behind will succeed for this organization specifically. So these questions is something that shouldn't be happening just in the OSPO team, or in just one person, the head of the OSPO, but should be communicating frequently with the organization. So even though the OSPO is a team, it should be acting also as an organizational level. So some recommendations for starting this minimum viable OSPO. First things first, find a dedicated person. I think this is something that has been working in many organizations. And it's important to have a person maybe that is already in the organization and knows the dynamics of open source, but that is able to perform various tasks, because an OSPO leader and an OSPO team is a multidisciplinary team. Also, build a matrix of experts. So as I said, the OSPO is engaging with the different teams on the organization, and you should be thinking of how to define the actors that are going to be engaging with the OSPO, and also the external collaborations. So the foundations your organization would like to engage with, those open source communities that can help you to navigate in open source, the maintainers from the projects you care most. Also around cultural change, Make sure if your organization doesn't know how to operate in open source to enable this open source cultural shift. Some organizations start thinking on open source as a business model, and it's not. And maybe some others just think like, yeah, this is a trend, an innovation enabler, that is right, but they don't see it as a commodity. And it's becoming somehow that, because we've seen in previously in my slides how most of the modern applications are containing already open source components. We are saying that open source is there, even though it's not tangible. Behind all the modern applications is there, and organizations need to take action and commitment. Also, make sure to let the organization understand that open source dynamics is a different way of working, is a different culture, and that transition is going to take time. And for that, there are many ways, of course, that the OSPO can work on that, but I would like to highlight one community that is in our source commons that is focused on how to enable this open source cultural shift in organizations. That, by the way, they recently started a working group, an OSPO working group. So the same there is in open source program office. There are some organizations that are having an inner source program office, maybe within the OSPO, maybe outside, but don't forget about this, this concept. Don't forget about the cultural change on the organizations, because if you build on top things and you forget about this baseline, many organizations are going to get lost. Oh my God, okay, now it's there back. Okay. Then choose the structure. Think about with the resources you have, if this OSPO is going to be a virtual OSPO, starting as a virtual OSPO, or maybe you're part of a bigger organization and you can think about making it in the CDO an engineering team, on the human resources team, and so on. There are different structures and depends on the organization. And another thing that is also working well for some organizations is work on the open source strategy document. One of the very first things to do as an OSPO team or as an OSPO leader, because this is going to help you to get everyone on the same page on an organizational level. And which is more important, and this is dealing with sustainability of open source in the organizations, preserve the open source strategy for new generations. I have many times organizations having an OSPO and then shutting down the OSPO and maybe in 3 years retaking this. And I think sometimes it's just about documentation. If you have everything documented, if the person that is the head of the OSPO suddenly goes elsewhere, the knowledge, the open knowledge can be kept in the organization for others to learn and to retake. And in this open source strategy doc, there should be many, many things. Some of those can be, for instance, communicate what you consider a sustainable project for your organization, or specify how you want the employee contributors, if it's a corporation, use and contribute to open source projects. Identify projects that are critical to the organizational goals, and also track and identify those dependencies that are going to sustain these open source projects. Define actors and external collaboration, and also specify how are you going to be engaging with them. And provide guidelines for making new decisions, like, for instance, how can we make more open source advocates? My employees, how can they be open source advocates and also give back to the community and not harming them? and provide open source best practices to foster this sustainable ecosystem. And there's been some discussions on, well, should the open source strategy docs should be just 1, 2, 3? Some organizations, what they are doing is having like a global one that answers the why and what, and it's more for an organizational level. And then they have the how-tos for every team. They are for those matrix of experts that are engaging in the OSPO. There are more as guidelines, checklists, and translates the general strategy. So this way, they are not working in silos, and they really knows how to operate. So it's not the same talking with the marketing team than, for instance, with the engineering team. They need different wording, they need different way. There are things that they should be know, and there are others that maybe is not important for them. So having these micro how-tos guidelines can help a lot. If you want to learn more about the open source strategy doc, there are some notes that we created as a community in the Ospology Live Netherlands. We did 2 weeks ago with other open source communities and projects involved. And also there's a comprehensive guide on different how-tos for open source program management best practices, and one of them talks about this open source strategy document. Also, another thing to consider is try to frame and to map where your organization is. This is an OSPO maturity model. As I said, your OSPO is not my OSPO, so maybe this works better for traditional environments. For other organizations that works on like traditional software companies might be like, okay, I'm already doing everything. But for those traditional environments, maybe it can help them to share to the organization where are they and how can they evolve over the years. So with this, we've seen certain topics that can help organizations to build this minimum viable OSPO that can act as this vehicle to enable open source sustainability in organizations and to maintain open source operations in the long way. But never forget that with all these checklists, there are challenges that the OSPO has that they need to resolve in terms of culture, in terms of tooling, on process, and continuity. And this is not the talk I'm going to be talking on that. There is a presentation I did with Thomas from EPAN system about the minimum viable OSPO a few months ago that you can deep dive in case you're interested to learn more about how to resolve those challenges, how can we work as an organization and communicate with the OSPO, and so on. So to end up with, I would like to share the different hats of the OSPO, because I think it can frame in just 3 strategic areas what the OSPO can do for the organization and also for the open source ecosystem, and how can they can build healthy relationships with each of them. So the OSPO sometimes acts as the environmentalist in terms of make it possible to have the open source efforts being sustainable in the long term. They can also act as the facilitator, so they can communicate with the different teams and also with the open source communities. So open source communities can come to them and they can share feedback, and they can bring that feedback and bring it to the organization and vice versa. And finally, they can act as the consular. So they can give advice on the different business units, on the different teams, on, as I said, what open source projects should we be investing of or funding, or what open source, how can we start collaborating more with open source communities, anything. They should be the open source experts, the ones that have the knowledge and can help the organizations to not harm the open source ecosystem. Here are some resources that are available in the todogroup.org is one of the many open source communities that are helping in the OSPO movement. And say that it's time for questions. Thank you so much.
It is almost party time, but I'm sure if anyone has a question, we've got time for a couple of them.
I was wondering if you had any advice for someone interested in joining an OSPO. I have an engineering background, but I have not really seen a lot of discussion about how someone ends up in an OSPO as a job.
How someone ends up in an OSPO?
Yeah, like what can a person do to join an OSPO? You know, like what sort of background or anything?
So to be clear, I'm not part of the of an OSPO. I'm part of the community of OSPO practitioners. So I'm sure some people that has an OSPO can share this better. I really don't have a specific answer. I think people that are already running the OSPO can share better feedback on that.
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering whether you are aware of, or what your opinion is around OSPOs being involved in, I guess, more adoption than procurement, but actually deciding to the CTO level at sort of advising on what open source projects companies decide to take up or organizations decide to take up, and evaluating the open sourceness of open source in many ways. I mean, obviously that's clearly a license issue, but there's a big difference between open core and a community project, and do they have a role in advising on those sort of adoption elements within organizations?
Oh no, there is no slides. I was just sharing my slides. But anyway, I was sharing the OSPO model I presented later. In the States there is an angle called leadership, and how the OSPOs, this model is the final output from the feedback that many organizations have in an OSPO shared in these researches, in a research study that is called the evolution of the OSPO. So those organizations were saying, yeah, our OSPO acts as this strategic advisor and are advising the CTO on how to operate in open source and project governance, for instance, and what open source project they should be taking more care and give more love to them. So yeah, we've seen, at least from the enterprise view, that has worked, and that there are many organizations already, if they are not doing that yet, the path is trying to become these strategic decision-making partners for the organization.